Hello, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really tough topic, family violence. We're going to peel back the layers to understand why this isn't just about individual actions, but is actually a deep, structural problem that's woven into the fabric of our society. To really get a sense of the scale here, just look at this number from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. 2 in 3. That's how many First Nations people who'd experienced physical harm said it came from a family member. That one stat just hits you. It tells you how widespread and how deeply personal this crisis is. You know, UN Women actually has a name for this. They call it the shadow pandemic. And that phrase, it's perfect. It forces us to see this isn't just a handful of tragic, isolated stories. It's a massive, hidden crisis affecting millions. It's the right way to frame this as we dig deeper.
All right, so let's get into it. To really understand what's going on, we have to look beyond the individual acts of violence. We have to look at the soil where these problems grow. What are the big systemic forces that are actually driving all of this?
So to get to the bottom of this, we need to wrap our heads around a key idea: structural violence. Now, this isn't about one person making a bad choice. It's harm that comes from the system itself, the way society's organized. Things like colonialism, systemic racism, and gender inequality, they create the conditions where people can't get their basic needs met, making violence all the more likely. It's a kind of harm that's almost invisible because it's just built in. And all that pressure from the system, it has to go somewhere, right? Tragically, it often gets turned inward. There's a name for this: lateral violence. It's what happens when all the rage, fear, and frustration from being oppressed gets redirected, not at the system, but at people within your own community. It can be gossiping, bullying, exclusion, and it just ends up perpetuating the cycle of harm.
Now, this slide is really interesting because it shows the difference between just paying lip service and making real structural change. On the left, you've got what's basically tokenism: hiring someone to check a box, asking for advice, but then ignoring it. But on the right, that's where you see meaningful change. It's Indigenous practitioners in actual leadership roles, where their cultural knowledge is truly valued and used to change how things are done, to challenge what one scholar called the dominant white Western paradigm. That's what tackling a structural problem actually looks like on the ground.
And here's the thing: these huge structural problems don't just stay up in the clouds. They trickle down, and they create these absolutely devastating personal cycles of trauma that can echo for generations. You can actually map it out, like a tragic set of dominoes. Researchers call it the intergenerational transmission of violence. So it starts with a child seeing or experiencing violence at home. That exposure, as you can imagine, leads to serious mental distress. And then, that distress makes it more likely that the child will one day perpetrate violence themselves. It's just a heartbreaking pattern, learned and passed on.
And the impact isn't just behavioral. You can literally measure it. For First Nations people in Australia, child abuse and partner violence account for a significant chunk of the total disease burden. And that third bar, wow. It shows Indigenous Australians leaving the hospital against medical advice at over 5 times the rate of non-Indigenous people. That's a huge red flag for a system that can feel unsafe and unwelcoming.
When we break down the specific types of harm against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids, the picture gets even more complex. Look at this. Emotional abuse and neglect make up about 80% of all the substantiated cases combined. It really highlights that so much of the damage is less visible than, say, physical abuse, but it's just as profound.
And the damage isn't just emotional. It shows up in school. Get this. One study found that just being aware of verbal fights between parents was linked to an 11% drop in a kid's school grades. An 11% drop. Think about that. That's a direct, measurable cost of trauma at home, playing out in a child's education. But what if we're not even seeing the whole picture? What if our very definition of trauma is too narrow? This quote from researcher Fiona Oates really stops you in your tracks. She points out that for the Indigenous people in her study, racism wasn't some abstract idea. It was a constant, active source of traumatic stress that just piled on top of everything else.
Okay, so we've seen this devastating cycle. The massive question then becomes, can it be broken? How do you even start? Well, let's look at a pretty fascinating, large-scale attempt to do just that, all through education. I mean, that's a huge question, isn't it? Kind of big, top-down, structural change, like a national law, really get in there and interrupt something as deep-seated as the cycle of violence. To find a possible answer, we're going to look at an incredible case study out of Turkey.
So back in 1997, the Turkish government passed a law that extended mandatory schooling from 5 years all the way to 8. Just like that, this one piece of legislation completely changed the educational reality for an entire generation of kids.
So the immediate effect was that women, especially those in rural areas, got about 1 extra year of school on average. But the real story here, well, it's about a lot more than just extra time in a classroom. It's about what that extra year of education actually set in motion.
And this is the profound part. The study found the policy worked like a circuit breaker, not because it taught parenting skills, but because, as it says here, it improved women's mental health and their life outcomes. That empowerment, in turn, changed how mothers who had experienced violence themselves behaved toward their kids, effectively breaking the chain of trauma. Amazing, right?
Okay, so we've seen the big top-down policy approach. Now let's go to the other end of the spectrum and zoom in on a solution that's deeply personal, local, and driven by the community itself.
This quote from a young Aboriginal person, man, it says it all. It's such a powerful reminder that the best solutions, the ones that really work, have to come from inside the community. They have to be grounded in lived experience.
And a perfect example of this in action is the Narayana Art Collective. Just look at the cascade of positive outcomes this one cultural program creates. It strengthens self-esteem. It connects young people to their identity. It acts as a buffer against racism and trauma. It gives them a sense of power and develops real skills. This is what healing from the inside out, powered by culture, looks like.
So, you've got these two totally different but both very powerful examples. What do they tell us about how to actually tackle problems that are woven so deeply into the structure of society? When you put them side by side, you see two powerful circuit breakers. On one hand, you have the top-down national policy in Turkey, which worked by improving mental health and life outcomes. On the other, you have the bottom-up, local art collective, which worked by strengthening cultural identity and resilience. They're two completely different pathways, but they both led to a similar goal. It shows us there's no single magic bullet.
And that really brings us to the core message of this whole explainer. It's simple, but it's everything. If the problem is structural, if it's driven by inequality, racism, and historical trauma, then the solution has to be structural too. You can't just focus on individual behavior, you have to change the conditions themselves.
Which leaves us with one last big question to think about. We see the individual acts of violence as the symptoms. But are we actually treating the disease, or are we truly addressing the deep structural inequities that allow the shadow pandemic to continue? Thank you for watching.